Todd Stern has been the representative of the United States at the Paris talks from 2009 to 2008 to 2016.
2009 to 16.
Right. And is now a visiting lecturer at the Yale Law School. So he's come here today to talk a bit about his experiences with international negotiations, and I hope you will be able to read his op-eds that we made available for you. And without further ado, I think I'll give the floor to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Does this work? Can you hear? Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I had the good fortune to now wait a minute. Doesn't somebody want me? You're good. Okay, great. I had the good fortune to be up at Brown in February and talk to lots of students about climate change and what was going on then. And I'm delighted to be back here now with this very interesting at this very interesting program with what I know is an international group of you all. So I'm delighted to be here. And we're gonna. This is going to be pretty informal. I'm going to talk for a while to provide some background, and then I think it would be best for you all to ask questions and just have some back and forth. So let me just get started. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the big Paris climate agreement that was reached in Paris in the end of 2015 accomplished and what it's about. I think because we inevitably always live in the moment, I think I expect that you will be interested in, and it's important in any event to talk about what is going on now in light of the Trump administration's posture toward climate change, and what I think about the decision that the president has made, and the implications of that, and then a little bit about what I think are the actions going forward that are going to flow from or respond to what the president has done, and both on the international at the international level and domestically. And I will try to do all of that in a short period of time, so that we have a good amount of time left for questions. And I would expect not to be speaking in this initial piece, certainly beyond 2 o'clock, and maybe even less than that. And if I'm going longer, I'll just cut myself off. So maybe we start with Paris itself, and I just for your information, I didn't include it in the links that I sent the other day, or maybe just yesterday even. But I actually just posted something today on the Brookings Institution website about the Paris Agreement that was kind of a response to something that was in a piece written by Ross Duhat at New York Times, conservative columnist, good columnist, but something that I thought needed answering. In any event, Paris. So without going into a lot of background on the dangers of climate change itself, although obviously we can talk about that later if you want. Let's just stipulate for the moment that climate change is a very serious problem that has really profound potential implications for all of us and our countries and the world. It is a quintessentially global problem, and in that respect, unlike many environmental problems. If you have a conventional air pollution or conventional water pollution type problem, that's often something that can be, usually something that can be remedied at a local level. So Los Angeles has an air pollution problem, or such and such a river is dirty. That those are things that can be dealt with locally. Climate change is completely the opposite. The carbon emissions that happen in India have just as much effect on the United States as the carbon emissions that happen in Indiana, and vice versa. Carbon goes up in the air, it spreads across the world, doesn't matter where it was released in the first instance. So it's a truly global problem, and because it's a truly global problem, you need a global regime, you need a global agreement to help guide action on it. And you start also from the perspective that what produces carbon emissions in the first place, mostly the running of our energy system. So mostly the burning of fossil fuels that make economies work, and that historically have been pretty much the only way that economies have been able to work. That's precisely what causes carbon emissions. Also, various kinds of land use activities, deforestation being the most obvious one, but burning of fossil fuels is quite central. So what that means is that the effort to control climate change affects everybody's economy. It's not a problem that's kind of that can be put in a fairly neat box and dealt with. I mean, the most before Paris, the most successful international environmental agreement that has ever been brought into place was the Montreal Protocol to control ozone-depleting substances. They were creating a hole in the ozone layer, and this is back in the sort of late 80s or so. And the Montreal Protocol was designed to control, limit, ultimately eliminate certain chemicals that created that ozone hole, and it was a highly important issue, and it was a global issue, but a narrow class of chemicals produced in a fairly limited number of countries. And a much easier problem from that perspective to deal with than climate change, which is, again, has to do with the things that run everybody's economy. So because you have that sort of a situation with regard to climate change, countries are all inherently, naturally going to want to know that if they act, others are acting. It's a global commons problem, if you've heard that term. I don't want to act if my competitor and my partners are not acting. I know it's going to cost me something, at least up front, to take action. I don't want to act unless I see that everybody else is acting also. So for all of those reasons, you need to have a global agreement. The original framework agreement was so-called UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was agreed to back in 1992. In the United States, that was under the regime of the first President Bush. It was broadly, I think, by consensus, agreed to in the U.S. Senate. Did not impose, by and large, individual obligations on countries. It sort of set out some broad parameters, and it's been the guiding, been the guiding climate agreement ever since. But ever since that time, it was only a short few years after that agreement that negotiators started working on an agreement meant to translate from that sort of those broad parameters into specifics of what countries needed to do in order to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, and the agreement that was issued from that effort was the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was an important advance in many respects. It's where I first I got pulled into working on climate change when I was minding my business, doing other things for President Clinton in the White House, and I was asked to jump in and help on that a few months before Kyoto. That's where I got my introduction to climate change, and at some level it has never quite let me go. But the Kyoto Agreement, while in advance, did not, I mean, very importantly, very consequentially, was not. It was agreed to at the meeting by the United States, but we could not join it because we could not get the support in our Senate to approve it. And you may know that the standards for again, the threshold for getting approval of an agreement, international agreement that requires the support of the Senate. Not all of them do. We'll get to that in a minute. But if it does require approval, the threshold is 67 votes. 2/3 of the Senate has to agree. And it is unbelievably hard to get 2/3 of the Senate to do most anything, and certainly anything relating to a very politicized issue like climate change, politicized in the United States. In any event, the reality is, so Kyoto didn't get very far in reality because the U.S. wasn't part of it, and then certain other countries, because the U.S. wasn't part of it, wanted to start pulling away from it, and also because, by definition, it only applied in terms of its obligations to developed countries. Okay, and that seemed to make more sense at one stage in the game, and gradually, as time wore on, made less and less sense, both from a point of politics, but more importantly from the point of view of substance, because you have, if you fast forward all the way to where we are right now, I don't have the exact numbers in my head now, but it's something like 60% and growing of global emissions come from developing countries for the perfectly good reason that they're developing. So they're developing, they're growing. Emissions flow from burning fossil fuels, and so there's just no way to deal with climate change as a problem unless you're dealing with all countries. Right, let me jump right in so I don't take too much time. Suffice it to say that from that 1992 agreement all the way up until Paris, there had been efforts, but none of them really successful, to develop an actual working regime with actual country commitments that could point us in a direction toward the kind of progress that's needed to deal with climate change. And so I came into the job of the Special Envoy for Climate Change for President Obama, right at the beginning of the Obama administration in 2009. And I was housed at the State Department, which has the lead for international negotiations in the United States. And at some level, the negotiations that culminated in Paris started right then in 2009. 2009, the effort was to negotiate an agreement for Copenhagen. It was seen in many respects, it was a chaotic meeting at the end of that year, and was seen around the world mostly as a failure, although we didn't think so in the United States. We thought that some important things had happened, and I think some seeds were planted in effect that turned into the Paris Agreement. But then over the course of the next years, and more intensively with the mandate, the actual specific mandate for the Paris negotiation that was agreed to in South Africa in 2011, that then put in place a 4-year negotiation, and Paris, and the Paris Agreement was achieved at the end of 2015. And let me just walk through some of the key elements of it. There were a number of hurdles that needed to be cleared in order to reach the Paris Agreement. First of all, consistent with what I was just saying, it had to be universal. Right? It no longer could be developed are in, developing are out. That just wasn't going to work. It had to be ambitious. The whole purpose is to deal with this huge challenge of climate change. So it had to be ambitious in the sense of driving emissions down worldwide, but had to be ambitious, knowing that those initial first set of targets that countries were going to put forward were not by any possible stretch of the imagination going to do the trick by themselves. All they could be was a start. They weren't even going to put us on the path that we needed to be on. They were going to get us closer to that path. But from the point of view of political realism, you weren't going to be able to get it all done at once. It had to address the fears of countries. I would say this was especially in developing countries, but not only, but the fear of countries that they would in effect be forced to take actions that they felt, quite understandably, could be inconsistent or contrary even to their core imperatives of growth and development. And you just can't base an agreement on the proposition that you're going to tell countries, well, you can't grow and develop because we got to fix this other problem. Countries aren't going to do it. I mean, again, everything. There is no point during the whole time that I was running these negotiations where the underlying principle, which you might have heard, it's a kind of American saying, so I don't know if you've heard it or not, but the saying is, politics is the art of the possible. You have to be ambitious, but you can't forget that fundamental principle, because that shaped everything. So universal, ambitious, it had to deal with those understandable fears of countries to not be forced to do things that they didn't feel they could do. It also had to overcome what many people on both sides of this divide came to refer to as the firewall between developed and developing countries. On the one hand, you could not expect developing countries to do all the same things as developed countries, because countries have different capacities. On the other hand, you could not base a system on the notion that every developed country, no matter how far, every developing country, no matter how far they'd come and how big their influence is in the world, was categorically in a different place than developed. To use language that was sort of often used in these negotiations, you couldn't say China and Chad would have the same expectations because they're both on the same side of this bright line that was established in 1992. We couldn't get the problem solved that way. But we also have to recognize a wide range of different capabilities among countries. So you also couldn't say, every country in the world is going to do the same thing as the United States or the EU, because that makes no sense either. So you had to deal with that problem. Agreement had to be transparent. It's very important that countries and observers, civil society, and everybody else be able to see what different countries are doing. What are their emissions inventories? What progress are they making toward the targets that they took, and so forth. It had to continue the tradition of providing assistance to poor countries. That was something that was written into the original 1992 agreement. It was something reflected even President George W. Bush, the second President Bush, never seen as a big friend of climate change, since he's the one who said, I mean, you could argue that he was just being realistic, but whatever. He walked away from the Kyoto Protocol. But toward the end of his administration, he started something called the Climate Investment Funds, a multi-billion-dollar fund. He pledged $2 billion over 3 years from the U.S., brought in maybe 10 other countries, and very useful fund designed to provide, to essentially build constructive clean energy projects in developing countries. So that idea of aiding developing countries always has been part of the regime, and you couldn't get a deal done without it. And then finally, the legal form of this agreement was a very, very touchy subject. On the one hand, there was a tremendous desire for there to be a legal agreement, a legally binding agreement. On the other hand, if an agreement were legally binding in every respect, there would be many countries, not the least of which the United States, but also India and any number of others, who would not have been able to join. So you had all of these sort of built-in challenges, these hurdles that had to be cleared, in some cases these circles that had to be squared, and at the end of the day, all of that sort of miraculously did happen. So Paris is a universal agreement. It sets forth a long-term vision of ambitious goals. There's actually several different ones, but the most famous of those is to hold the increase in global average temperature well below 2 degrees centigrade, as compared more or less to pre-industrial times. It was bottom up in its structure, opposite of Kyoto. Kyoto countries developed only, as we've said, but the countries negotiated each other's targets. Targets were not acceptable unless everybody agreed on them. This was the opposite, bottom-up structure, nationally determined, in the lingo of the actual agreement, nationally determined contributions, but nationally determined targets, if you will. Countries make their own decision about what they can do, and of course that's essential in dealing with the problem that I talked about earlier of countries being afraid that they would be forced to do things that they felt that they couldn't do. So no, we flipped it around. We flipped it around so that it's bottom up, not top down. It was based on initial targets that consistent with what I said earlier. They made a good start. They didn't go far enough, but they bent us off of the path that we were on, and now there's still a lot of work to do. The agreement includes 5-year cycles. Every 5 years, starting in 2020, countries need to review their targets and essentially re-up them with not a legal requirement, but a strong encouragement built into the agreement, a kind of norm built into the agreement that each time you keep doing better and better, you keep taking more and more ambitious targets with respect to the emissions that you're going to reduce. Another way to look at it is to think about the path. You keep getting on a stronger and stronger clean energy path, if you will. It replaces Paris replaces the old firewall. You no longer have this absolute division between developed and developing countries. But at the same, so you have on the one hand an understanding that everybody's treated the same from the point of view of kind of the legal character of the agreement. You don't have an agreement that's binding on some countries, not on others. Insofar as the agreement is binding or not, and as we'll get to in a second, that depends on the issue. Then that applies to everybody. But there are also flexibilities built in for the specifics of what countries need to do, the targets they put in, the way the transparency system works, and so forth. That is flexibility based on country capacities, not based on what category you're in, per se. The agreement has a sort of hybrid legal structure. Some of the critical elements are legally binding, but others are not. So essentially, process elements are legally binding. It's legally binding that you put in a target. It's legally binding that you put in successive targets on a periodic basis. It's legally binding that you report on on both your inventories and your progress in implementing your target, and that you be reviewed on that. Those things are all legally binding. There's various rules, some that still remain to be written, that will be legally binding. But the targets that you put forward, so the United States put a target forward, every country, or most countries put forward targets, those targets are not legally binding. They are strongly encouraged. They're a kind of politically binding, if you will. It's not supposed to be casual, but the targets themselves are not binding. And that hybrid structure was the thing that made it possible for all countries to join. I think that and the bottom-up structure, those two things were most important in allowing all countries to join. And again, allows the U.S. to join because the nature of this very carefully negotiated agreement is that we could treat it President Obama could treat it. President Obama did treat it as an executive agreement. I'm not going to get into a whole sidebar on the different ways that the United States is permitted constitutionally to join international agreements, but to take it from me for the time being that one of those routes is as an executive agreement if the content of the agreement is consistent with that treatment. So the Kyoto Protocol, we could not have done that. The nature of the content of the Kyoto Protocol made it absolutely clear that within the U.S. system, that was an agreement that the president could only join if it received 2/3 approval in the Senate. The nature of the Paris Agreement, completely different. It did not require that treatment, and so the president was able to join it. So in short, Paris has built a regime that it promises to be effective. It was acceptable to basically all the countries in the world at the start, and it is built to have a kind of evolving quality with those every 5-year renewing targets that is designed to be able to help guide the world precisely in the direction of meeting the climate problem and meeting the climate challenge. So this was a big achievement. All the countries in the world, save Nicaragua, who in some respects was not complaining about the core of the agreement, but thought it didn't go far enough in certain respects, and Syria. Everybody else has signed on to this agreement, except that now President Trump has decided that the United States would be part of the group with Syria and Nicaragua rather than the other 195 countries in the world. And that's obviously was a very disappointing move by President Trump, and I think, as I have written about in a number of articles recently, I think a very wrong-headed move. President, if you had the misfortune to watch his comments in the Rose Garden, he paints Paris as a terrible deal for the United States. The rest of the world will be laughing at us. It's such a bad deal for the United States, and in fact, I mean, there's just absolutely no basis for that. The agreement does all of those things that I just described, and was designed with a tremendous amount of United States input. I think significant United States leadership, going all the way up to President Obama and my direct boss, Secretary of State Kerry. So the agreement is actually very strong. I think that the idea that the United States would pull out does tremendous diplomatic damage to the United States. I mean, you all may have your own reactions about that, but my strong belief, and it's a belief that I think you can see also expressed by former secretaries of state on both the Democratic and Republican side, when for a country like ours to take an action like this on something so important with so much buy-in around the world, having been worked on for so long, and where you have so many countries who are rightly fearful of the dangers of climate change, is a slap in the face to countries all over the world, and certainly not the sort of thing that anybody who cares about this issue or cares about the standing of the United States would like to see. Very interestingly, there was extraordinarily broad business support for the Paris Agreement in the United States. The Fortune 100 companies, just about across the board, even oil companies, supported the U.S. staying in Paris. That was dramatically different from that time back in 1997 I was telling you about earlier, when I was drafted by President Clinton to help on the Kyoto Agreement. Back at that point, there was not much corporate support in the United States for this issue at all. And now you see a kind of who's who of major American companies saying we should stay in, and they say that for good reason. That because unlike too much of of some of those people who are in Washington right now, business leaders have to be fact-based. They can't operate on the basis of ideology, or else they're not going to be successful business people. They know climate change is a real problem. A great many of their companies are making plans about how to deal with climate change, and in more and more companies making plans for how they can reduce their own emissions. They know so they know that climate change is real, that it's dangerous, that Paris is a good agreement, that it's a balanced agreement. They can work with it. They know that there are all sorts of follow-up things that still have to be done, guidelines and rules and such that have to be negotiated. It's good for American companies to have American negotiators at the table, to be mindful of their interests, and they also see that one of the biggest economic opportunities worldwide for decades to come, maybe for this whole century, is going to be the transformation of the energy base of the global economy from fossil fuel to non-fossil, from high carbon to low and no carbon. That's one of the biggest games in town. I mean, just look at what China's doing. Look at what the United States economy is doing. Look at Europe. Look at countries all over the world. This is where we have to go. We have to go there rapidly. And for the U.S. to sort of position itself as a pariah on this issue is very much not helpful for U.S. business. So for all sorts of reasons, U.S. business was very much supportive of it. You would have thought that the kind of original U.S. businessman president would be sensitive to that, and yet he stuck to his kind of ideological guns. So I think very unfortunate. I think I can take questions on that, but I'll move off of that now. In terms of what happens next, I think I would just say a few things. I think countries will not follow the United States to the exits. I think countries will stay in the agreement. I think that countries recognize that this issue is quite crucial. It's not going away. The Paris Agreement establishes that regime that, as I said at the beginning, we need. You have to have a global regime. If Paris were to fail, you just have to start negotiating Paris all over again, or its successor. And it was extraordinarily difficult. Lots of kind of stars aligned in a good way to get Paris done. So countries are going to stand by Paris. I think if it was a long-term, if for over the long run the U.S. was on the outside of Paris, I think it would make it extremely difficult for the regime to be successful. But I think countries are more going to be betting that in a hopefully shorter rather than longer time, the U.S. will be led by a president who wants to bring us back into the regime. I think in the U.S. you are already seeing real mobilization and determination on the part of a number of states, cities, companies, universities, et cetera, to express their determination to carry on with clean energy activities and to urge that we stay faithful to Paris. I think the most important part of that is states and cities. There are a dozen states and I think 200 cities that have already made an announcement just in the few days since the president announced that we were going to withdraw. So I think you're going to see a lot of that kind of activity on the international side. As I also just alluded to, there are some really quite important elements of the overall Paris regime that still need to be negotiated. You imagine an agreement where maybe it's 15 pages long and you've got a page and a half or so on transparency and reporting review, and very carefully negotiated a very good article of the agreement, but there's more detailed guidelines that need to get worked out. And all of these things in different areas are called for to be done basically over the course of the next 3.5 years or so. So there will be that work that goes on. And I'm 8 minutes past where I said I would be, but I'm going to stop myself now so that we can open the floor, and happy to talk about, to hear your reactions about what's going on yourselves. Tell me, either ask questions or give comments about how things look from your own countries. And let me stop and open it up, and just tell me if you are raising your hand to talk. Tell me what your name is and where you're from. And
Thank you very much. So, would anyone like to go ahead and begin?
you don't have to be shy. It's always hard at first, but somebody will go first.
Please begin by presenting yourself and showing.
I'm Nimisha. I'm a PhD scholar from India. And my question to you is that you said that the companies are still they were pro-climate to stay in the Paris Agreement. And so in the what next format, do the financial capital drives the climate change policy and it continues working outside? And so do the companies still want to take forward the idea of climate change within their own business plans, business models? Or do you think the fact that President moving out of it will be a deterrent for them?
That's a very important question. I think it will be somewhat mixed. I think that my own view is that the smarter companies will conclude that it is very much in their interest to just keep going, essentially as if the U.S. was still in and Trump had not taken that action, because you have a tremendously dynamic situation in economies right now with respect to the development of clean energy, and the markets involved are huge. Think about you're essentially transforming the global economy over time, and this radiates out into all sorts of different ways. There's obviously the different sources of energy like wind and solar and so forth, but there's also all kinds of greater efficiencies that are with which energy is used, so that you get more work with less energy. There's the whole world of electric vehicles. I mean, in all the big sectors, if you think of emissions, are power, transportation, and then buildings and industry. Buildings and factories and such, and you have this, I guess, sort of two things to bear in mind. Very, very, very rapid developments in a good direction with respect to the cost of all sorts of cleaner energy. So, just as an example, in the United States, since 2008, so since President Obama came in and up to now, the cost of solar panels, solar PV, photovoltaic, has dropped 85%. The cost of wind energy has dropped 66%. These are both getting very close to competitive on a non-subsidized basis with coal or natural gas. And you have more and more of that. Those improvements are continuing, and you have a sort of a similar, earlier in the cost curve, but a kind of similar development happening with respect to the storage of electricity through batteries. So that kind of capability is very important to allowing power, more and more solar and wind into the power system. Because sometimes the sun's not shining and sometimes the wind's not blowing, so it's important that you can capture excess, store it, and use it when you need it. And the costs of that have been very high. The costs of that, though, just sort of in a way that parallels wind and solar, are coming way down. Not far enough yet, but they're moving fast. So you have all sorts of innovative developments going on with respect to energy across the board. So you have that happening on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have to remember that this is a global economy, and you have tremendous progress being made, and in countries and in different companies. There's a big article. I'm not remembering if it's today or yesterday, but very recent article about the huge strides that China's making with respect to all of this kind of clean energy stuff, and China's determination to become the #1 producer. So if you're a U.S. company, do you really want to sort of step off and say, well, so Trump is here, so I don't have to think about this for a few years, but all the other developments in the real economy, domestically and internationally, are going ahead? It's not a good bet for you to jump off. Certainly, if you're a company that could be competitive in that world, and even if you're not a company competitive in that world, but you are in some other sector, but you still are going to face sooner or later. I mean, you should be facing it right now, but even if you're not facing it as much with Trump, you're going to be facing a tremendous need to reduce your emissions, to get on a cleaner path. And it really doesn't make sense to kind of go backwards or just sort of stop acting. Some nonetheless will do that. I think that's true, but I think that you will see, from a business standpoint, again, business leaders, if they're good, are fact-based. They're not ideology-based. That doesn't help them to listen to a bunch of Republican, ideological diatribes about climate change on Capitol Hill. They have businesses to run, and they're going to be uncompetitive if they don't go forward. That's my view.
Can I ask a question related to that? So if there's room for states and businesses and cities within the United States to take steps towards being a part of the Paris Agreement, do you see there being ways to account for those steps as well, and to take, as I see, part of the role of the Paris Agreement is exactly to account for the changes that are taking place, and so to stay on top of that.
Yeah. So the way I think that this is likely to go is, so let's just think about this in terms of U.S. states and cities. They can't be literal parties to the agreement. The parties to an international agreement are countries, and that's not going to change. What I think that people are very interested in doing is finding the best possible ways for there to be, in essence, a kind of platform for players like that to be able, in an international setting. Imagine this might be on the margins of a there's a big climate meeting at the end of every year. They're called COPs because it's Conference of the Parties. So Paris was COP 21, if I'm remembering right. So each year there's a big meeting. There should be I think a lot of people think there should be a capacity for states and cities to be able to come and report that here's what we're doing, here's what we have accomplished, here's what our program is, so that people, I think it's particularly important with respect to the United States right now because our national government is looking the other way, but it would be a good thing for the world to see that there are major important centers of power and influence and economic might in the United States that are committed and are acting. I mean, one interesting fact to keep in mind, California, if you looked at it by itself, it would be the 6th biggest economy in the world. And it has a climate and clean energy program, which has been, developed over years and particularly aggressively by this Governor Brown, but Republican governor before him, Arnold Schwarzenegger, was also very good at this. You ought to be able to have states come and present what they're doing and even to have people tallying up and counting what the impact is, but without them being parties itself, because that they're not, and I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, my question is, okay, by the way, my name is Oluwole Koka from Nigeria. The question is within a larger question. I share the passion with which you spoke about what went into the agreement that is now threatened by the new government. My gut feel tells me that beyond what we have heard before about continuity in government, how easy is it for a succeeding government to truncate an agreement that is seemingly now binding on a country by just a stroke of the pen? I say this in relation to the current campaign by humanities-based scholarly associations in the United States to mobilize against the decision of the current government to cut maybe grants or whatever, I don't know, budget for humanities funding. How easy, that's my question, how easy is it, where is the place of continuity in governance? For example, let me use the clearest, the fastest one that comes to my head, the diversity visa program. The what? The diversity visa program for countries of global south, Africa and the like. How easy is it for a government to just come and wake up the next day and put a stop to such an existing protocol?
Right. Very appropriate question. It is so. There's a kind of legal answer to the question, and there is a more of a political, practical answer to the question. So let me start with the latter first. I don't know if there has been a time. I haven't done a study of this. It's certainly extremely unusual. Maybe it's happened before, but I'm not even sure that it's happened before. For one U.S. administration to follow another, different parties, Democrat following Republican, Republican following Democrat, and reversing course on an important international agreement that the United States has already joined. And that's exactly what President Trump is doing. So that gets to the legal issue, which I'll get to in a second. But I think it's deeply inappropriate, and precisely because it makes it. I mean, if our international, and not just the United States, it's true for any country, but we're talking about the United States. If the nature of what we're talking about, if what the United States communicates to the world in effect is the agreement's no better than the 4 years of whoever the president is who's in power, or less, maybe because there's just a little bit of time left while he's in power or she is in power, then it becomes very difficult for countries to have reliance or trust on any country who's in that posture, and that's why it's either very rare or unprecedented that you see this kind of thing. In terms of the legalities of it, well, unfortunately, the legalities of it are such that in the United States look, the legalities are such that generally countries agreements provide for the possibility of a country to withdraw. I mean, that was true in Kyoto, for example. Canadians withdrew. And there are, I think, generally, if not always, withdrawal provisions that are written right into the agreement, the way that you do this. And that's true for Paris, by the way. As a technical legal matter, actually, the United States cannot withdraw. The United States can't literally be out of the Paris Agreement until November 4th of 2020. So it can, as a practical matter, the president says, we're out, we're paying no attention to this, we're not going to send our negotiators, we're going to ignore our target, we're not going to put in any money, we're not going to participate. Well, as a practical matter, then the United States has essentially withdrawn right away. As a legal matter, following the specific article in the Paris Agreement that explains how you withdraw, and I can give you more detail if you want, but it'll go all the way till November of 2020. But as I said, the agreements usually allow that, and I think it's allowed whether an agreement is fully legally binding or not. But countries are typically sensitive enough to the importance of diplomacy and the importance of their word and their standing that when they inherit an agreement, they stick with it. So this is a very, very unusual, if not unprecedented, thing that the president's doing. Lots of people here. Yeah, let's go to the back. Yeah, and talk loud.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting talk. Ali Razi, University of Tokyo. Going back to what Syria raised on cities being able to meet this target, the U.S. agreed beforehand. What are the main challenges for U.S. states and U.S. cities to meet the target, basically?
To meet the target that the U.S. has right now?
Yeah.
Well, so the U.S. took a very ambitious target. I had a lot to do with that, but as did a number of people on our team. And the target was 26 to 28% reductions below our 2005 level by 2025 essentially of greenhouse gases. And that was meant to be ambitious. I mean, we knew that it was going to be hard to get there, but we also calculated that did actually a lot of economic and analytic work so that we felt that we could do it. I think that the Clinton team, for example, had looked and analyzed where we would be on the basis of Obama policies and thought we would be pretty far, but still there would be a gap if you didn't do more. And so the Clinton team had outlined some set of policies, and undoubtedly if Hillary Clinton had won and actually became president, they would have been doing a lot more work to put in place policies meant to get what probably would have been an extra 3 or 4% reductions to reach that target. So now we have a situation where the one of the people who was actually on the Clinton team and actually worked on my staff while I was there and runs a firm now in San Francisco that's an analytic firm, and they calculated that based on where we are now and what is sort of likely to happen without additional effort, we would be probably not better than a 19 or so % reduction by 2025. So there's a considerable gap. I think if we have, if you made the assumption that there was going to be no more national policy, it's not necessarily true because Trump might get beat in 2020, but if you assume no more national policy all the way out to 2025, it'd be very hard to get all the way to that target, even with aggressive action by the states and cities that have expressed themselves. You could get closer. I mean, if you were at somewhere in the 17 and 19 range, you could move that up. But you probably wouldn't get all the way there without more national policy. With this caveat that sometimes things just happen, they develop in the real economy itself, not really based on policy so much. So one example of that, good example of that a bit earlier, started happening in the late first decade of the 2000s, is a dramatic increase in the use of natural gas in the United States because of a new technology that's called fracking. Has its own environmental challenges, but it allowed there to be a huge increase in cheap natural gas in the United States, and that had the result of replacing a bunch of coal in the power sector, utilities deciding to buy natural gas rather than coal. Natural gas is still a fossil fuel, so it's still polluting from the point of view of climate change, but about half as much as coal. So all of a sudden we had emissions dropping, not because of any sort of definable new policy. There was some research and development dollars that had been spent once upon a time, but it wasn't because there's a new policy to do X, Y, and Z. It's just because there was something that was developing in the economy. There's all sorts of different predictions about the pace at which electric vehicles are going to penetrate our economy. There's a lot of advance going on, but there's still tiny percentage. If for reasons not really related to policy, you just saw like that really take off. You had a kind of exponential curve. I would love to see that happen. I doubt if it'll happen, but you could have that sort of thing that would then cause more rapid. But it'll be hard to get all the way to that target. Next. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. My name is Erika. I'm from Mexico, and I work in international cooperation projects. So my question, I have a couple of them. I'll try to just make one. In the context of declining hegemony of the United States in the world stage, to which extent is your concern about the impact that withdrawing from the climate change agreement is in terms of the impacts in the environment, and to which extent is it about the political outreach capacity of the United States as a world leader? Because in one of your
political
outreach capacity, like
yeah.
its leadership in the world stage. Because in one of your articles, you talk about diplomatic malpractices and the diminishing of the U.S. diplomatic capital. So it seems like it's one of your big concerns as well in terms of like the role China and India, for instance, are gaining. So I want people to elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of what's happening to the union right now in the United States, where some states, like you said, California and Texas are, I think, the two biggest economies in the U.S. So their capacity for negotiating and continuing the actions of the climate change is really big. So for a lot of countries, like in the case of Mexico, we think that a way forward with the U.S. relationship will be kind of initiating bilateral regional diplomacy with California and with Texas, for instance. How do you see that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think that that this is hugely damaging for the United States. I mean, I don't think it's permanently damaging. I think that the United States has a reservoir of there's a reservoir of its reputation and standing that is not, that I guess I would say, I would hope that it's going to go in the closet a little bit, but you're going to be able to like open the closet door in 4 years and it'll still, you'll be able to bring it back out, and it'll be. That doesn't mean it'll just like start up and be exactly where it was before, but I don't think this is, I don't see this as a permanent thing, as long as we can keep this little electoral experiment that we're in the middle of limited. But I think it's, I just grabbed something that I quoted in one of my articles because I think it's well stated, from George Shultz, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State. So, obviously I'm a Democrat, you can tell, but George Shultz was a lifelong Republican. and his quote about the idea of pulling out of Paris is, global statecraft relies on trust, reputation, and credibility, which can be all too easily squandered if America fails to honor a global agreement that it helped forge. The repercussions will undercut our diplomatic priorities across the globe. I mean, that's the issue. And so we have all sorts of diplomatic priorities that involve national security and international economics and all sorts of things. And if diplomacy is not it's not magic, right? I mean, it's about the relations between countries and between people. And if you tell countries you care about that they can go take a hike, they can drop dead. You don't really care about what they care about, and then you want them a month later, you're not going to get such a good reception. So I mean, it's not a lot more complicated than that. Obviously, there are other issues where countries have mutual needs that the United States continues and will continue to be a very important player all over the world. And so even the fact that even though many countries might be mad at the United States about climate change, they're not going to stop dealing with us. But it's just not, you're just not going to be, you're not going to look like you're a leader, and you're not going to have the capacity to bring countries with you in the same way that you would before. I don't think it's so much that, at least I don't look at it so much as a concern that this or that country is going to get advantage as compared to us. It's just that you lose standing all over the place. And in the context of climate, certainly the two classic biggest players, because we have the biggest so-called carbon footprint, are the United States and China. And China, I think, is in a very, in a way that I would applaud, has stepped up and said, right away that they're going to stick with the agreement. It's important. They're not going to walk away. Instead of having these two big players up there together, now you have one. Now Europe is very important and will still be there, but it's different. And the U.S. and China, have historically been those big players. And truthfully, the diplomacy that was done, and that I spent a tremendous amount of my own time on over the course of a number of years between the U.S. and China, was, if you had to pick one biggest diplomatic thing that led to this agreement getting done, I think it's the understanding that the U.S. and China reached together. Although I will also tell you, so that nobody gets too dewy-eyed about it, we did manage to work together, and to develop, I think, very good relationships. I have a wonderful relationship with my counterpart, and every step of the way was a battle on both sides, all the way through till the last day of Paris. So it's not that it's easy, but we reached understandings that we knew that we were going to both try to get this thing done. Yes.
Thank you. I am Gregorio Mesa, a lawyer from Columbia National University. In similar way, my question is, we know the voluntary agreement is very different to mandatory agreement. What do you think after the Trump decision, you think change in real life the difference between obligatory and mandatory and voluntary agreement like Paris?
Well, so the legal nature of this agreement, it's neither mandatory nor voluntary. I would say it's a mix, and it's a mix. As I was trying to explain earlier, there are important elements, and they're mostly the elements that have to do with process. You have to put in an agreement. You have to put in a target. You have to put in successive targets every 5 years. You have to report on what you're doing. You have to be reviewed on what you're doing. You have to do X and Y and Z, mostly having to do with the process and sort of the accountability that's built into the agreement. The targets themselves are not legally binding, and various other things are not. And I don't think there's anything about the Trump decision one way or another that would impact my view of that as a useful structure, because let me just say that question of, is it all going to be mandatory, or is it going to have mixed mandatory and, if to use your word, voluntary aspects? That was being discussed in the second week of Paris still. The reality is there was no agreement to be done that was mandatory across the board. Because you would have had, first of all, the United States would not be in the agreement, because an agreement like that would have had to go to the Senate for so-called advice and consent for approval, would have required 2/3 of the Senate to approve, and there was not a ghost of a chance of that happening, 0 chance of that happening. You would not have gotten India. India was not prepared to do that. I don't know about China. China in the agreement, China in the negotiations always said that they would do it. I kind of thought that China was happy to say that they would do it because they knew that we wouldn't let it happen. So it was easy to say that they would do it. Nobody would blame them because they knew the Americans were going to go and fight that one out because we had to. But I don't think China wanted that. That's a debate. But I would say there would have been many countries who would not have done that in the end. Even if they were saying we're for it, they were for it for somebody else, not for them. So I think that you would have lost many developing countries because they would have been worried about, do I have a legal liability now? I take a target, I'm going to do X, and I do my best, but I don't quite get there. Now what happens to me? Am I in trouble? So that's, again, that I go back to what I said at the beginning. You have to filter everything through the lens of the art of the possible. And I think that, by the way, partly because it was a necessity for us, but also because I was forced to think about it a lot, I think you would have had a less ambitious, not a more ambitious agreement if everybody's targets were legally binding, because I think many countries, if they were faced with that and they decided, I will join the agreement, would have put forward lower targets out of fear of the consequences if they put forward ambitious targets and they couldn't quite meet them. And there was a very interesting discussion that I was there for over 7 years. So there was, Mexico was the host of the meeting in 2010. And usually about a month or 6 weeks before the actual conferences at the end of every year, so remember, they're called the COP, the Conference of the Parties. So there's the host for that year usually hosts a meeting of maybe 50 countries or so that has come to be called the pre-COP. And it's not everybody, but it's sort of representative of everybody. And at that meeting that Mexico hosted, Patricia Espinosa, who was the foreign minister at the time, is now the head of the UNFCCC, the climate body worldwide, hosted a lunch for the ministers. And from the United States, I was our minister. I was in that lunch, and there was no agenda per se, but there was sort of an open discussion. And the discussion came up about essentially the question that you're raising. And somebody said, well, okay, so let's look around the room. Would your countries put in the same target if you were facing binding consequences? And several countries, it was off the record, several countries raised their hand and said, no, we would not. We would go lower. So, I think that many people assume that legally binding is better just because it sounds tougher, And I think that they assume that, that it's more meaningful for that reason, but I don't actually believe that. And I think, and again, even if something is legally binding, if countries, countries act out of their own interests. So Kyoto is legally binding. Canada didn't think it was out of their interest. They left the agreement. I think that you can do a lot. And not only can you do a lot, I think it's the only way these sorts of things are going to work over time is if if norms and expectations get built up so that everybody understands that they're going to look bad, they're going to present a bad, it's going to be a bad for their image and bad for the world if they don't push up. And again, remember, this was not fully, this is legally binding in core respects that have to do with the accountability. So your target's not binding, but everything having to do with your accountability to meet that target is binding. Next. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Aru Joseph. I'm from Nigeria. I'm a climate analyst. In 2015, there was a conference in Africa that brought together African countries on the climate change issue, which was a precursor to the November Paris Agreement. I was at that meeting, and I also visited at the pre-COP at Paris. And one of the major issues was the fact that developing countries were skeptical of the fact of the developed countries, especially the big players, US, India, China, and how they were going to actually commit to this deal. And most of the developing countries felt that if there was something, if not hardcore legally binding, but something that was a bit more concrete or a bit more cast in stone, it would have been a bit more feasible. Because backtrack to the Kyoto Accord, down to the Mexican conference, you realize that there were a lot of promises that were made, but as we've seen time and over again, promises don't make for nothing. You can make promises and a lot of people don't keep to it. The Paris Agreement, a lot of people from developing countries felt that there could have been more. But because US and China were on the table, as well as I think India got in because of US and China, those countries put their acts on the table like, okay, we're going to do it because these two guys are also doing it. Now that the US is out, yes, China is in, but I think this might trigger a whole lot of other issues that we are not actually considering now, because a lot of all these countries that are a bit skeptical before wouldn't want to commit again, because most developing countries took more than their fair share of the cut, which they might not have felt up to. But because they feel, okay, we don't want to go short of the global standard, we are also doing this. And now the US is out. And whether we like it or not, if the US stays out, a lot of other countries might start to rethink their commitment to the climate agreement. And of course, I'm sure you're very well aware, because you're an expert in this, of the business of climate change. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, and that is what actually pulls the strings in this issue. So what could be done to actually possibly find a way to nip this, because it's going to have a trigger effect, whether we like it or not. The US is their house. A lot of businesses that don't want to commit to it before now have the leeway to say, okay, we are no longer doing it anymore. And a lot of people that didn't want to go in but went in because of the big players now have the leeway to actually pull out. And this is not, the impact on the environment is not going to stop. So what do we do? What could be done in the nearest future?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I guess I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I think that one of the critical issues is that that the U.S., the current U.S. posture ends up being relatively short-lived. I mean, I do think, as much as I said, that I think countries will stay for the time being. I think if you tried to imagine a Paris Agreement working for the long haul with the U.S. not in it, I don't think it will. I mean, I think so I think there's a timing issue. It would obviously be ideal for so many reasons, but including climate change, if this, from my point of view, if President Trump was with us for only one term. And I think if you had a more moderate U.S. administration come in, you would see the U.S. back in the agreement. I don't think that there's a single other Republican candidate, if you go back to the Republican primaries in this election, if any other Republican candidate had gotten the nomination and won, they might be lukewarm about climate change. I do not think anybody else would have pulled us out of the agreement. So I think the timing, the length of time of the U.S. being out, I think matters. I would hope that the countries, whether in Africa or anywhere else, at least in the short term, I hope and I think that in the short term they will stick in. I think that they will stay where they are in the agreement and conclude that it would be more damaging to pull out. And I think that would be the right conclusion, and I think most countries will reach that conclusion. And I think the leadership of both the leading countries like China and India, but the leading players in the Africa group or the least developed country group or the island group and so forth will reach the conclusion that it would be damaging and indeed just a big reward to Donald Trump to pull out now. I think that with respect to countries, the actions that countries take themselves, remember, these are nationally determined actions, so countries should be, doing their best, but they can make their own determination of what to do. And in the case of many of the smaller, poorer countries around the world, I think the important thing is to be part of the regime, to be trying to move in the right direction. But in terms of overall global emissions, if a country is here or here, if there's a small difference in a small country, it's not going to be that big you're not going to have that much impact. So, I would say that countries are going to be much better off making smart choices about how much to do, as much as they can, but obviously in a way that they can afford it. And then, I guess this is maybe I'm sort of going off just on a slightly different angle, but I think it also relates to some extent to the question about legally binding. The thing that's going to make all of this work is if a dynamic gets going in the global economy where we are, it's sort of like a snowball. If the snowball really starts to roll faster and faster because actions keep building on each other and you hit a critical mass so that the global automobile fleets are becoming electric and renewable energy and other non-fossil energy is becoming dominant. Those are the things more than that this or that provision is legally binding that's going to have the big impact. And I think the thing that was so powerful with Paris, damaged a little bit now, but still was a signal that was that I think was heard loud and clear in countries all over the world, in civil society all over the world, in big companies all over the world, that okay, now the countries of the world have decided they're going to take this issue on in a serious way. We need that to continue, and so I would certainly hope the countries stick in there.
Thank you. Just following up from my friend, what my other colleague just indicated. We've been here as a platform. My name is Stephen from Ghana. So we are here to learn and to share experiences from across other countries. So I would like to find, Ghana has already made attempts to develop plans to implement the agreement. But they are worried now, a bit worried now that the US government has pulled out from the agreement. So I would like to find out from you, what should be our discussions with the government of Ghana to reassure them that there's a need for them to continue to implement the Paris Agreement? What should we tell the government of Ghana or the government of developing countries?
Well, I think that the agreement is not going to go away. That the agreement that and look, one never knows these things for sure, right? But I think that the best bet, you have to make a bet. You always have to act on the basis of probabilities in life, in politics, and diplomacy, and in national policy. And I think the better bet by far is Paris is going to continue. The big players are going to stay there. The United States will be back. This is a very unfortunate detour, but the United States is going to be back. If you look at the broad range of support in the centers of power of the United States, we're not talking about environmental groups. These are all the big companies in the United States, and the public, and on. That it's going to go forward. It might be a little bit bumpier than we had hoped for a few years, but this is a regime that's going to be with us for decades and decades, and it just makes a lot more sense to stay in there and try to move forward. And I think the EU will step up and do a lot. China's going to do a lot. There's countries. A question from Colombia. Colombia has been a leader along with Peru and Chile and Mexico and Costa Rica. There's a group of progressive countries in Latin America called ILAC. I think the smart, but climate change is not going away, unfortunately. It's going to get worse every year. If you made this agreement go away, you'd have to do a new agreement. So I understand the worry, but I think we're unfortunately in a somewhat uncertain place right now, but it's a much smarter bet to stay with it.
My name is Diana Menya from Kenya. I'm not quite sure I understand what your president actually wants. So maybe he has said it, and I haven't read it because it's a little bit difficult to read what he says. But maybe he's got alternatives. What alternatives is he offering to this? Or maybe what he wants is to do not to do anything, but to do something to reduce the emissions, but not as part of an agreement, so that later on he can say, yes, United States can go it alone, and United States can do something. It can make a difference in the world, but without being part of an agreement. And whatever it is that he has in mind, as long as it has his name on it, somehow he takes credit for it. But in the end, he's got the results that would have been obtained, in terms of reaching the targets. I don't know whether he has, or maybe you can speak to offer any alternative.
Yeah. So, I'm sort of sorry to say that I don't think that there is much policy thought that, you're looking for what he really is seeking from the point of view of policy. And I don't think there's an answer to that, to tell you the truth, because I don't think that's what's going on here. I think that there's a worldview that the countries are getting the best of the United States, and that the United States is his own words. Just read the Rose Garden speech if you can stand to. That countries are laughing at the United States and taking advantage of the United States, and that it's a bad deal, and he promised in the campaign that he was going to get us out of that bad deal, and his priority is to help the people in the United States, particularly sort of in the industrial parts of the United States that have lost jobs and so forth, to get us out of these bad deals and put coal miners back to work. And there's no policy. I need a little bit more water here. There's no policy plan there. Excuse me. So I think he wants to be able to say that he kept his promise to pull us out, and I know he said in the Rose Garden that he would be prepared to renegotiate and come back in if it was a better deal. But first of all, I think as a realistic matter, that's completely ridiculous. It's not going to happen. I mean, first of all, the United States did not get a bad deal. Countries do not perceive the United States getting a bad deal. It takes 195 countries to agree on anything here. We just agreed to this landmark. I mean, to me, it's nonsense to think that there's going to be a renegotiation. But I also don't think if you sat down and said, okay, what do you want the result to be, you wouldn't get anything more with more substance than a better deal. In what way? A better deal. You're not going to get more than that. I mean, I'm sorry to say that, but I think it also comes from, again, a worldview which is not shared. I mean, there's real divisions within this White House and this administration, and there are plenty of the leaders in the administration who don't think about things this way, but there are some who do. And I think they got the upper hand this time, and that worldview is very anti-globalist, very much it's sort of America first, right? And if you try to get sucked into that awful world of international negotiations and agreements and Europe and all of those other things, you just you try to avoid it. So I think that it's not representative of either the Democratic or the Republican Party historically, but it's representative of a certain I think actually fairly small wing of sort of small segment of thinking. It's just that it happens to include the president right now.
So it's 3 o'clock, and I realize you do have places to go. Would you like to take a couple more questions?
I can take a few more questions. I don't know what everybody's schedule is, but I can. Let's see here. I'm okay for a while more.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Lami Kachina from Zimbabwe. I'm a researcher at the Center for Applied Social Sciences. My question is about, we really do agree that the challenges, the problems of climate change are faced by different communities, in different countries, on a different level, and we really do agree that developing countries are the most, face these challenges most than in other countries. The developing countries face these challenges most than in other countries. And at the same time, the developed world is at the most in causing climate change. So from your experience in negotiating for the climate change policy at an international level, are there any measures or punitive measures that could be done to the developed world so that if they exit or if they don't abide to this climate change policy, they could pay in another way to these developing countries so that the communities in the developing world will not suffer much and they would have a way to restore their activity?
Yeah, so look, I think that the question is essentially whether there are measures, punitive measures or whatever that could be applied to developed countries if they are not doing what they should be doing, particularly in light of the special challenges faced by developing countries. That's basically what you're asking, right? And I think that I don't think that that's the kind of thing that you can negotiate. Remember, and maybe I probably should have said this at the beginning because it's a very important feature of these negotiations to keep in mind. Essentially the rule of decision in climate negotiations is it's it's not exactly this, but it comes to the same thing. It's basically a consensus rule. So it's not that you need to have 51% of the countries, or even 60 or 70% of the countries. You have to have everybody. Everybody has to agree. And you know, sometimes as a, you know, if you see the whole, I mean, go back to in Mexico in 2010, Bolivia was objecting vociferously at the end, and you know, the Mexican leader of the negotiations was up on the dais, you know, with the gavel, and you know, sort of looking, seeing no objection, and there's Bolivia jumping around, but that, and then they hit the gavel, and it's done. You can do that if there's one or two, or maybe even three. You can't do that if there's many countries that are objecting. So you have to have everybody on board. So once you start to say, we want to have punitive measures for people who don't do X, Y, or Z, you're not going to negotiate that, because there's going to be too many people that disagree. Some countries have talked about the notion of imposing some kind of border adjustment taxes. This didn't come up really in the first instance. Maybe it did come up in connection with the United States, but it's an idea that has come up in various ways in the past. And so could you say, if the United States were to step out of the agreement, as Trump says we are going to, and that gets formalized, if other countries wanted to say, well, now you're not doing what you're supposed to do on climate change, so we're going to impose XYZ tax on your goods as you import them into our country because we're taking action and you're not, you know, could that happen? I mean, I think it's, that's not as a matter of international agreement. That would be more as a matter of countries deciding that they were going to, either individually or some countries were going to get together and say, we're going to impose these taxes, and then there'd probably be a big fight about it in the World Trade Organization or someplace, and see whether that could be, you know, whether that would survive as legitimate or not. I don't know, but I think as a matter of negotiating, I don't think you'd be able to do it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Anil. I'm from Nepal, but currently based in University of British Columbia, Canada. So you have just said or shared to us that President Trump pulling out from Paris Agreement, it actually has done great damage to years of negotiation for climate change since Kyoto Protocol. So my question to you is, you as a being, as a opposition of Trump and his policy and his party, what are your strategies and concrete steps that can address this kind of problem, so that you can regain the trust around the world and
Well, that's a hard question. I think that I can give you a few sort of partial answers to that. Right now, and till through 2020, the Trump administration is in power, and there's only so much that anybody can do on the outside. I think that you are seeing a tremendous amount of activism that is kind of mushrooming up, growing in the United States. There are, counting businesses, states, cities, businesses, universities. There's, I think, over 1,200 that have joined on to some kind of new. I don't know if it's an organization or just a kind of, I don't think it's an organization, but it's a new effort that is called We Are Still In, so sort of we're still in spirit, we're still in the Paris Agreement. I think, as I said before, I think you're going to see a lot of effort by cities and states that have progressive leadership to say, you know, here's it. We have a climate program. We're doing this much. Now we want to try to do that much to make up some of the difference. I think you'll see a lot of civil society organizing. 350.org, which is that kind of NGO organizing group that is active on these issues, is organizing with a bunch of other groups, rallies or marches, I think even this coming weekend already. I think you'll see more activism probably on college campuses like this one. So I think you'll see a lot here. I think that it's also, I have been encouraging, and but many other people as well, the notion that I alluded to earlier, that there be some means by which, in particular, state and city action, maybe also companies have the right kind of platform to be able to communicate, send the message globally that significant parts of the United States are actually very engaged. In the period from 2001 to 2008, after the second President Bush withdrew the U.S. from the Kyoto process, I think that the general sense in the world was the U.S. overall was just kind of gone. There was nothing happening in the U.S. on these issues. And so I think it's important that the opposite be conveyed, that even though, as I said in one of my articles, Washington may have gone dark, the Trump administration, but there's a lot of activity elsewhere. And so I think that's important. And then I think also, in some fashion, it would be a good thing for knowledgeable U.S. players to be interacting from time to time with other important players in the negotiations: China, India, Europe, some of the island states. There was a group of countries that formed themselves into what came to be known as the High Ambition Coalition in Paris, which included a lot of those players. And to have conversations about the actual concrete follow-up steps that have to get negotiated after Paris. The shape of the reporting and review regime, the more detailed level, so I think that it would be a good thing for knowledgeable U.S. Players that could include somebody like me and others from my team, maybe in tandem with states and cities. I'm not sure, but to be able to convey a sense of what a progressive U.S. regime would think about X, Y, or Z issue, which is that I think that there is, it's not necessarily the case that view would be conveyed by Europe or this one or that one or the other one, because everybody's got their own particular circumstances, and the U.S., even the most progressive U.S. regime, still has administration still has concerns that are really U.S. focused. So I think having some mechanism to be able to exchange views, even if it's not coming from the Trump government, but from people who are knowledgeable, would be another good thing. And so, as much positive international engagement as we can have, I think, would be a good thing.
Hi, my name is Miriam. I'm a researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial
I'm sorry,
Research. I'm a researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR, in South Africa.
Great.
And I'm really concerned with Trump's issue of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. And I was just wondering, would this have any implications on the U.S. government funding for climate change in developing countries, or even within the U.S. itself? Would that have any implications, or it's just him and?
No, I think it'll have very bad implications for funding. Actually, I'm sorry to say. I think that at multiple levels. So you could think about the funding from the United States kind of in three buckets, if you will. The smallest one is funds that are actually provided for the operational running of the UNFCCC, right? The UN Climate Organization, and that's, if I'm remembering right, that's in the neighborhood of somewhere between $10 and $15 million. That's not a lot of money, but I think you could. Former Mayor Bloomberg, has already announced that he'll write a check for the whole thing through his own foundation to make up for the Trump administration saying they will provide no money for it. So that's the first bucket. The second bucket is the funding that the U.S. has traditionally provided on a bilateral basis to countries all over the world, many countries in Africa, Asia, South America, so forth. And that is mostly, not entirely, but mostly has gone through USAID, the Agency for International Development, which is, broadly speaking, a part of the State Department, although tends to be quite autonomous. I think their funding will be slashed. It might be zeroed out altogether, I'm not sure, but it's going to be bad. So that's bilateral money that is provided to, I don't know how many countries there are now. I don't remember. I would guess we probably, from a climate point of view, probably provided money to 30 or 40 countries or so. I don't remember exactly. Maybe somewhat more than that. And then the third piece is the money that the U.S. provided to the new Green Climate Fund. That's a new multilateral financial organization. People often get confused and think that the pledge was to provide $100 billion a year to this new Green Climate Fund. That was actually never the pledge. There was a pledge to mobilize from public and private sources $100 billion a year from all the developed countries to developing countries by 2020. That's still a working pledge. A lot of that is anticipated to be mobilized from the private sector in various ways. But in any event, the Green Climate Fund is a part of that totality, and there were about $10 billion pledged as a sort of initial funding effort by developed countries to get the Green Climate Fund going. And I feel like that was 2014. And the U.S., for our part, pledged $3 billion over a 4-year period, which may have been the highest, but it was certainly high. And President Obama, in his administration, but President Obama, with a lot of personal commitment to it, managed to get from the Republican Congress $500 million in each of the first 2 years, which was a little less than we would have wanted ideally, but was a Herculean feat to get that from a Republican Congress. So the U.S. has already made good on $1 billion out of that 3. I think what you're going to see now is 0 for a while from the Trump administration, from the United States. I don't think that they'll. I mean, Congress was basically forced to do it by Obama, and now the Trump administration is not going to be interested in doing that. So hopefully there will be. U.S. is only one big player, but only one player. So they'll hopefully this funding will continue from others, and the U.S. will fall into arrears until we get a different administration, I think. I mean, all of this can also change somewhat if the Democrats were to win either the House or the control of either the House or the Senate 18 months from now in the 2018 elections. That's not impossible. I mean, that's, the numbers make it hard in the Senate because in the Senate, there's 100 members of the Senate. They each have 6-year terms, and they're staggered so that every 2 years, a third of them are up for re-election. So either 33 or 34, depending on the year. And as it happens, in 2018, out of the 33 members who are up for re-election, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's something like 22 or 23 are Democrats and only 10 or 11 are Republicans. That means if you're trying to win seats, so the Democrats need 3 more seats. They have 48. We need 51 to get a majority. But there's only 10 or 11 Republican targets. That makes it, and there's 23 Democratic targets. That makes it hard. In the House, there's a better chance. I mean, the majority is I don't know if it's 20 or 25 or so, but it's a lot more members. And if that happened, you could all of a sudden then have a big push from one of the houses saying, you know, we have to have, this is a priority, we have to have at least some funding for these causes, or else we're not going to agree to other things. And now you need us because we're in the majority in this body. Right now, they can say those things, but you're just wasting your breath because you have no power. You need power. Yes, back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Deborah Alaiba from Nigeria. I'm a lecturer at GIS Department at Regional Center for Training Aerospace Studies. I want to know the implication of this change in policy in terms of the pull of the United States from the Paris Treaty. I want to know how it would influence all the investments that have been made to combat climate change, via researches, grants, and I want you to tell me how the implementation would be now when people, find scientific facts that are really of their impact, if the the recommendations made by these scientists will be taken seriously to combat climate change.
Well, it goes back to where, part of the answer is money directly from the United States is going to be scarce, I think. Hopefully there will be other places that can make up some of the gap, whether it's other countries or it's places like the World Bank or the African Development Bank or places like that. Some philanthropic, but even philanthropic, the amounts of money that we're talking about here are probably large enough that philanthropic sources can only do so much, but some of that can be helpful also. But certainly there's going to be an impact because of the U.S., but not, again, U.S. is a part, but only a part, and there's a lot of other players as well. So how a particular grant's going to, I've said I don't know that, but there'll be some challenges for sure.
So on that note, I think we might have to cut it short. Do you have enough time to?
If I'm out of here at 3:30, I'm okay.
All right. We also need to agree then we'll take a very brief break before our next speaker. So we'll, just so you know that we'll do that very quickly, all right? And that way we can spend the most time possible with that speaker.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Mona Kanabiraj. I'm Iranian Canadian, but based in Iran right now. I know that there are ideas of applying carbon tax and carbon tariffs for the trades, and after this decision of United States, Canada has brought this idea up again about applying carbon tariffs for the international trades. Do you see this as like kind of an opportunity for the United States to be enforced to go back to the Paris Agreement again? Do you have any comments on this?
guess I'm skeptical that it would actually happen, just because, however much people might be annoyed with the United States, rightly, is how big a fight does Canada want to have with the United States, for example? And I'm not speaking from my own point of view, obviously, as you can see, but you were going to say something else.
I was going to say it wouldn't be only Canada, of course. Maybe
No, I understand. Look, I think if you had if there were a large number of countries who said that and some sort of was sometimes referred to as a border tax adjustment that was devised, and you could from a technical and quantitative basis, you could figure out how to do it in a way that seemed like it was fit with the U.S., what the U.S. was doing. Maybe. I mean, again, it's certainly true that countries have talked about this. I guess my skepticism, I suppose, is that I think would be challenging to figure out a way to make it work, a defensible way to make it work sort of from a quantitative standpoint. I think that there will be many countries that by the time this kind of a policy kind of percolates its way all the way up to the leader of the country, they're not going to be so keen they're going to have other priorities. They're not going to necessarily want to get into that kind of a fight. And I don't know whether, I'm not a trade specialist or certainly a trade lawyer, so I don't know to what extent you run into other kinds of problems. So to me, it sounds more like the kind of thing that people will talk about but not do, but I might be wrong.
I'm Gemma from the United Kingdom. You just talked a little bit earlier about the diplomacy that takes place behind the scenes between individuals. I'm just curious about that, really, because we don't hear a lot about that. So, just wondering from your perspective, how do you feel characteristics such as gender or ethnicity or the country where you come from or personality, how do you think that really shapes the decisions that are made? Because we talk about it as if it's China talking to the USA, but it's actually...
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say a couple of things about it. First of all, countries, and you can't ever forget this, no matter how good a friend you're making with somebody on the other side, countries act out of their own perceived interest. So, and that's never going to be trumped by the fact that you've got a great friend in India or wherever it might be. Having said that, diplomacy is a personal business, and it's a personal relationship business also. And I had, just to come back to China for a second, I had the great fortune of having a counterpart all the years I was there, and he's actually still there, a counterpart in Shenzhen who was somebody who I got along with very well. We liked each other, and we both, I think, spent a lot of time quite mindfully and intentionally developing the relationship in a variety of ways. He came to my house for dinner in Washington. I took him to a baseball game in my hometown, Chicago. He took me to his hometown in China. You do these things that are, first of all, enjoyable, but also you try to build some reservoir of trust. So I never for a minute thought China was going to act in some way other than what was perceived to be in China's interest. But still, a sense that you're trusting each other means a lot. And I think, I had very important relationships with people in India and Singapore, in the UK, and many other places. Yeah, go ahead.
I hope you don't sound rude, but why do you think you're the best person for it? Why were you chosen for this position? And what is it about the people that do this type of diplomatic relations? what the type of people are they? And not to generalize, but
I think it's hard to generalize. I, of course, was chosen for my innate charm and good looks, but no, I think that people come into these positions in all kinds of different ways. I think that I did not, I was a political person in the in the U.S. People are there are people in administrations that are career people at the State Department or Treasury or this place or that place, and there are people who come in sort of the top level jobs that come in with whatever the president is, and more so probably in the U.S. than in many other countries. So I think that it's not so much in the U.S. that, like, I didn't get into the job I got into because I had developed an impressive track record of international engagement, because I didn't have a track record doing that really. But on the other hand, people who were making these choices knew me as somebody who was had worked for 8 years for President Clinton in doing a number of different things, and who I think was always regarded. I've always been regarded. I think this is one of my characteristics as somebody who integrates substantive and political considerations well, and but wherever you are, there's some power that be that's going to make a decision to bring somebody into a particular position. And in other countries, there's probably more of a it's probably more likely that there will be a track record, so to speak, of somebody. Brazil's got a wonderful foreign ministry and foreign service, and people they generally move up the ladder and wouldn't get a position like this unless it was pretty clear they were suited for it. But I think this has been a great group with great questions. I think now I better go because I have to go to the airport. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody.